Picture this: God's hands are tied, not by chains or ropes, but by something far more binding: our pride. Today, we're exploring how mercy flows through daily, weekly, and yearly rhythms, why humility is the foundation of God's kingdom, and how a tax collector's simple prayer reveals the secret to unlocking divine grace. By the end of this episode, you'll understand how to position your heart to receive God's mercy and why self-investigation might be the most important spiritual discipline you've never practiced. So let me start with this wild concept from the Sabbath school lesson, that when we block mercy, God's hands are tied. Help me understand what that actually means.
It's fascinating, right? The lesson points to this idea that God's nature is mercy itself. But here's the thing: mercy can only flow where there's humility to receive it. When we're filled with pride, we literally create a barrier that prevents God's grace from reaching us.
So it's not that God doesn't want to give mercy, it's that pride makes us unable to receive it?
Exactly. Think about Jesus' parable in Luke 18:9-14 about the Pharisee and the tax collector. The Pharisee stood up front, thanking God for his own perceived goodness, while the tax collector stood at the back, beating his breast and crying, "God, be merciful to me, a sinner."
And Jesus said the tax collector went home justified, not the Pharisee. That's completely upside down from what we'd expect.
Right. The lesson quotes Ellen White saying, "It is only he who knows himself to be a sinner that Christ can save." The Pharisee's pride literally blocked him from receiving what God wanted to give him.
Okay, so that's the foundation. But the lesson talks about these different rhythms of mercy, daily, weekly, yearly. What's that about?
This is where it gets really beautiful. The lesson mentions that every morning the blessings are new. That's our daily renew of grace. It's like God resets the mercy counter every single day.
So we're not operating on yesterday's mercy. We get fresh grace every morning?
Exactly. And then there's the weekly rhythm, the Sabbath. The lesson talks about the Sabbath rhythm of mercy. It's this built-in pause where we remember that our value doesn't come from our work or achievements.
That's interesting. So the Sabbath isn't just about rest, it's about remembering our dependence on God's mercy?
Right. And then annually, there's the Day of Atonement. The lesson connects this to the investigative judgment, which might sound scary, but it's actually about mercy too.
Wait, investigative judgment and mercy? Those seem like opposites. How do they connect?
Here's where the tax collector becomes our model. The lesson says that investigative judgment is the foundation of God's kingdom, and the tax collector investigated his own heart. He allowed the Holy Spirit to work on his heart for transformation.
So investigative judgment isn't God trying to catch us doing something wrong, it's us honestly examining ourselves?
Exactly. The tax collector did his own investigation. He looked at his life, saw his need, and cried out for mercy. That's what opened the door for God's grace to transform him.
And the Pharisee?
The Pharisee refused the investigative judgment of his own heart. According to the lesson, he stood on his own work, blamed others, and doubted God's character, that God is merciful and humble.
So by refusing to examine himself, he actually made himself equal to God?
The lesson says he made himself equal to God and higher than his fellow brethren, violating the principle of heaven. In heaven, serving others makes us higher, not exalting ourselves.
That's such a different way of thinking about greatness. Let me ask you this, what does this look like practically? How do we actually live this out?
Well, think about Moses. The lesson talks about how he was very humble, more than all men who were on the face of the earth. But he wasn't always that way.
Right, he started out pretty confident in his own abilities, didn't he?
Absolutely. The lesson mentions he was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and deeds. He had power, riches, popularity, everything the world values.
But then he made that impulsive, sinful act and everything changed?
Exactly. The lesson says through that act, he lost his self-confidence and self-sufficiency. For 40 years in the wilderness, with mountains as his classroom walls and pride swept aside, God taught him what he needed to know.
So God used failure to teach humility. That's actually encouraging in a weird way.
It really is. And the lesson points out how different Moses' leadership would have been if pride had crept into those big moments: the burning bush, the plagues, crossing the Red Sea, receiving the 10 Commandments.
So humility wasn't just a nice character trait for Moses, it was essential for his calling?
Absolutely. And here's what's really striking. The lesson quotes Ellen White saying, "There's nothing so offensive to God or so dangerous to the human soul as pride and self-sufficiency. Of all sins, it is the most hopeless, the most incurable."
Wow. The most incurable? That's pretty intense. Why is pride so particularly dangerous?
Because we often don't see it for what it is. The lesson says, in our state of self-sufficiency, we choose not to self-evaluate. Pride becomes king, and we stop examining ourselves honestly.
So it's self-perpetuating. Pride prevents us from seeing our pride?
Exactly. That's why the lesson emphasizes that we need to stop, self-diagnose, and ask God to open our eyes to our true state. Pride may be the number one factor keeping us from a close relationship with Him.
This connects back to what you said about God's hands being tied. If we can't see our need, we can't receive His help.
Right. And that's where Jesus becomes our perfect example. The lesson talks about how He said, "Yet I am among you as the one who serves." Even though He was God, He took the position of a servant.
And the disciples were arguing about who was the greatest while Jesus was literally serving them?
Exactly. Luke 22:24-27 shows them disputing about greatness, and Jesus responds by pointing to His own example of service. The lesson says, He gave up heaven to die for the human race, hoping they would understand His act of grace.
So true greatness is actually about serving others, not being served?
That's the upside-down kingdom Jesus teaches. The lesson quotes Philippians 2:3-8, which talks about how we should live in light of the cross, with humility, considering others better than ourselves.
But here's what I'm wondering. How do we actually cultivate this humility? It's not like we can just decide to be humble and make it happen.
The lesson gives us a beautiful answer to that. It says when we look to Jesus, everything else, especially ourselves and our own perceived greatness, pales into complete insignificance.
So humility comes from beholding Jesus, not from trying harder to be humble?
Exactly. The lesson quotes Ellen White. In one way, only can a true knowledge of self be obtained. We must behold Christ. It is ignorance of Him that makes men so uplifted in their own righteousness.
That's fascinating. So, the closer we get to Jesus, the more we see our need for Him?
Right. The lesson says, the closer we draw to Christ, the more we realize our sinfulness and unworthiness. But that's not discouraging, it's liberating, because it opens us up to receive His grace.
So it's like the tax collector's experience. The more honestly he looked at himself, the more he could receive God's mercy?
Exactly. And the lesson emphasizes that this is how we can grow in our relationship with Jesus, only when we are humble. Pride blocks growth, but humility opens the door to transformation.
You know what strikes me about this whole conversation? We started talking about God's hands being tied, but really it's about our hearts being opened.
That's beautiful. And the lesson shows us these rhythms, daily, weekly, yearly, that help keep our hearts open. Every morning, new mercies. Every Sabbath, a reminder of our dependence. Every year, a time for deep examination.
And the tax collector shows us what that examination looks like. Honest, humble, desperate for mercy.
Right. He investigated his own heart and allowed the Holy Spirit to work. That's the foundation of God's kingdom, not self-righteousness, but humble dependence on God's grace.
So when you step back from all this, here's what really matters. We have a choice every day about whether we'll be like the Pharisee or the tax collector.
Exactly. We can stand on our own works and blame others, or we can honestly examine our hearts and cry out for mercy. One leads to justification, the other to spiritual blindness.
And here's what's amazing. God's mercy is available in all these rhythms. Daily renewal, weekly rest, yearly examination. It's like He's constantly creating opportunities for us to receive His grace.
That's the beauty of it. God's nature is mercy, and He's designed these rhythms to help us stay connected to that mercy. The only thing that can block it is our own pride.
So here's my challenge for everyone listening. Start your own investigation. Not to condemn yourself, but to open your heart to God's mercy.
And remember, the goal isn't perfection, it's humility. When we humble ourselves, God promises to exalt us in due time. That's the upside-down kingdom where servants become great.
Want to know if God's hands are tied in your life? Look at your heart. Is there room for mercy, or is pride taking up all the space? Because here's the truth. God's mercy is new every morning, available every Sabbath, and ready to transform you every year. The tax collector knew the secret. Humble investigation opens heaven's door. Thanks for joining us on Co-Pilot Podcasts.